Imagine yourself walking through the long corridors of a cold palace, where flickering torches cast shadows across the face of a queen, a face so disfigured that even her most loyal courtiers whispered she was no longer human. They believed her flesh and blood had been possessed by demons, that she bore a dark curse no priest could banish. This is not merely a story of a madwoman, it is a tragedy etched into her very body, where physical pain and mental torment twisted together into invisible chains that dragged her into the abyss. She was Queen Juana of Castile, or as history remembers her with a mixture of pity and fear, Juana Loca, Joan the Mad. But if you think this story is only about madness, you will soon realize you are mistaken. Behind that infamous title lies a darkness few dare to speak of. The grotesque disfigurements of her face and body, the unexplained pain, the long nights of anguish and isolation, and above all, a court that would rather believe she was possessed than face the truth. Was it truly a supernatural force that touched her fate, or was it simply a medical condition the era could not comprehend? Today, we will open the door to the past and explore the tragic life of Queen Juana, the power struggles, the fear, and the betrayals that turned a proud monarch into a shadow imprisoned for the rest of her life in a palace as cold as a tomb. Born at the peak of power and under a dark destiny, Juana, the second daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, could never have imagined that the royal blood in her veins would become the beginning of one of Spain's greatest tragedies. You gently close your eyes, trying to imagine yourself as a small servant, quietly standing beside a cold stone pillar, watching the shadow of Queen Juana slowly cross the grand hall. Every step she took echoed with a heavy thud, as if the ground itself shuddered under the weight of the secrets she bore on her shoulders. From a young age, Juana was renowned across European courts for her delicate beauty, fair skin, luminous eyes, the kind of gaze that made princes fumble like they were holding a phone for the first time and couldn't figure out how to silence it. But then, just as she reached her 20s, she began to change. Not the cute kind of change like frizzy hair and humid weather, but a silent, terrifying transformation. Juana's face swelled in a way no one could explain. Some old portraits still preserved in museums today depict her with an almost vanished chin, her face round and bloated like a harvest moon. Some whispered she had been infused with demonic energy, as if her tragedy was a horror movie mixed with a failed gym session. The historical event everyone agrees on is this. In 1506, her husband, Philip the Handsome, known across Europe for his looks and intellect, though the latter was never thoroughly verified, died suddenly. The shock tore Hannah's soul apart, plunging her into a grief no words could soothe. Historians still debate the depth of her mental collapse. Some say it was severe depression. Others believe she suffered from hereditary mental illness. And some believe she was simply a woman who loved to the point of despair. One often overlooked fact is that Juana kept Philip's corpse with her for months, carrying it from city to city, claiming she couldn't bear to part with him. It sounds like something out of a Gothic novel. But honestly, if someone did that today, they'd likely be referred to a therapist, or at the very least, unfollowed on social media. Think about it. If you lost the person you loved, and had to live in a court full of gossip and malice, where every glance judged you, every step was scrutinized, your mind might melt like wax too. Juana, already weakened by illness, grew increasingly erratic. She had uncontrollable fits of rage, nights of endless screaming, and long, vacant stares like a breathing statue. Later generations would call her Mad Juana. But in truth, that madness was a convenient label used by the powers of her time to strip her of authority. A grieving queen is pitiful, but a possessed one is easier to imprison in a castle without resistance. Another strange detail. Historical records say Juana was so afraid of the dark that every night she demanded hundreds of candles be lit around her room. The scene must have been surreal. A room blazing with light in a shadowy castle, where a woman sat motionless for hours, her bloated face bathed in a yellowish waxy glow. If you sleep with a nightlight today and still feel uneasy, remember, At least you didn't burn down the supermarket's candle aisle just to get some rest. At the time, Spaniards began to whisper that she was being punished by dark forces for her pride. Even so, some modern medical texts suggest she suffered from Cushing's syndrome, a condition where high cortisol levels cause facial swelling, abnormal weight gain, and emotional disturbances. These symptoms spiraled her into a cycle of fear, shame, and isolation. Tragically, back then no one knew what Cushing's was. They only saw a queen whose body distorted more each day, whose mind became increasingly fragile, and they concluded she had been bitten in the heart by the devil. If you've ever been judged for your appearance or emotions, imagine Hannah's tragedy amplified 1,000 times under the unblinking eyes of the most powerful people in Europe. One morning, the servants found her sitting in a chair, eyes wide open as if staring through the thick stone walls, her mouth mumbling words no one could understand. People said that was the moment she had gone completely mad. But some scholars believe she was simply exhausted by loneliness and despair. Perhaps you've had moments when your mind was so weary you didn't bother explaining anything to anyone. The only difference is, you weren't a queen locked in a cold fortress. Either way, that castle eventually became Hannah's spiritual tomb. Each night, her sobs echoed through the halls, blending with the faint crackle of burning candles, then fading like a curse no one dared to name. And if you're wondering, could things like this still happen today? Just more quietly, the answer might not be very comforting. Picture yourself holding a small oil lamp, stepping through a heavy stone door into a dim room laced with the scent of dampness. In the corner, Queen Hannah sat curled up on a carved wooden chair, her prematurely silver hair tangled over burdened shoulders. If anyone had seen her at that moment, they would hardly believe she was once the most powerful woman on the Iberian Peninsula. Even in confinement, Hannah held on to a faint awareness of her royal status. Sometimes, she ordered court rituals to receive envoys, even though no one ever came. Records say the servants had to lay out velvet cloths, arrange fresh flowers, and stand in silence for hours waiting for an imaginary delegation. It sounds pitiful, but think about it. If you were trapped for years in a tower colder than your freezer at home, maybe you too would throw a banquet just to remember who you used to be. There is one official event that most sources confirm. When her father, King Ferdinand, died, the power in Castile fell completely into the hands of her son Charles V, the emperor who would go on to rule an empire where the sun never set. Charles was only in his 20s when he officially ascended the throne. But it's said he saw his mother more as a problem to be dealt with than a queen in her own right. Some historians have fiercely debated whether Charles ever truly wanted to free his mother from captivity, or if he was only interested in preserving the prestige of the Habsburg dynasty. What few people know is that Hannah, despite being cut off from most of the outside world, still secretly sent letters. These letters, sometimes desperate pleas to see her children again, sometimes just a few lines describing the relentless pain in her chest, are still archived in Spain today. In one of them, she wrote, "I have never ceased to be queen. Whether they lock me in darkness or smear my name with lies." Reading that, you might find her both tragic and defiant, like a mother clutching her dignity, even when the whole world turns away. One of the few attendants allowed to visit her said she would often stare out the window, where the setting sun cast light on mottled stone, and sigh so long and deep it gave everyone chills. If you've ever sat alone in a dark room, watching the clock inch forward, not knowing how to escape your sadness, then you've touched a small part of Hannah's shadow. A strange detail that modern medical researchers still debate is why Hannah's illness worsened so quickly. Many suspect that, beyond Cushing's syndrome, she also suffered from severe depression coupled with delusional disorder. Others argue that it was the imprisonment, isolation, and constant underlying scorn from her family that truly broke her mind. You see, sometimes illness isn't just in the body but the result of an environment so toxic. It becomes an invisible cage, but no matter what you call it, a disorder, a curse, or the consequence of dirty politics, the end was the same. Hannah spent the rest of her life within 4 stone walls. Each morning, A tray of cold food was placed on her wooden table in silence. And every evening, she still demanded hundreds of candles to be lit, to chase away a darkness that perhaps only existed within her heart. You might chuckle at her insistence on candlelight, but think about it in today's world. Aren't we the same? Leaving dozens of phone tabs glowing all night just to forget our loneliness? The only difference is, Hannah's candles had no off switch, and her fear never went to sleep. If you're wondering how someone born at the pinnacle of power could fall into such a depth of despair, the answer is both simple and heartbreaking. It was her own family, those who should have protected her the most, who first built the cage. Ferdinand, the cunning father, exploited his daughter's mental collapse to continue ruling Castile. Charles V, the ambitious son, made no move to remove her chains once he ascended the throne, fearing that a frail queen would tarnish the prestige of the Habsburg name. From time to time, priests were brought in to exorcise demons from her body. They recited prayers, sprinkled holy water onto a frame already racked with illness. And if that makes you feel suffocated, then you understand. Sometimes superstition and politics can join hands to turn a person into the scapegoat of their own uncontrollable suffering. Hannah lived like that for nearly half a century among candles, shadows, and a loneliness thick as lamp smoke. And when she finally closed her eyes, it was said she looked more at peace than she ever had in life. A truth that, no matter how sarcastically phrased, no one would be cruel enough to call happiness. Yeah, you lean back, take a deep breath, and if you have the patience to sit with me a while longer, I'll tell you more clearly who she really was, and why an entire kingdom trembled at the name of a woman so fragile. She needed hundreds of candles just to keep from falling apart. She was Juana of Castile, born in 1479, the second daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, the powerful royal couple who unified Spain into a single nation. Just being born of those two bloodlines destined Juana to a life that would never be ordinary. Imagine being born a chess piece on the European board. Before you could read, people were already discussing who you'd marry. Before you understood love, you were nodding to a prearranged marriage. At 16, Juana left Spain for Flanders to marry Philip the Handsome, a young duke both proud and flirtatious. Many records say that when they first met, they were instantly smitten, and I don't blame them at that age. When everything is new and sparkling, it's easy to believe love can soothe all political ambition. The historical event everyone recalls is their lavish wedding in 1496, with processions and gift-bearing carriages stretching for miles. But what few mention is that on her wedding night, Juana wept for hours from loneliness, a Spanish girl unfamiliar with French, adrift in an alien court. Some scholars argue that those early years planted the seeds of her mental fragility. But when Philip became King of Castile, things only got more complicated. He was a power-hungry politician, always seeking to consolidate control. Juana, despite her title as queen, it was sidelined from major decisions. You've probably heard that before the feeling of being reduced to decorative royalty, useful only to beautify someone else's throne, a strange detail rarely known by later generations. Though the court doubted her sanity, Juana possessed an exceptional memory and governing ability. She could recall exact taxes by region, the names of nobles, even the terms of treaties her mother had signed. Many official letters still survive showing Juana managing state affairs with a precision that intimidated ministers. Yet life is not always fair, especially for a queen living in a world of men clad in armor, speaking power like it was their native tongue. When Philip died suddenly in 1506, some say from malaria. Others whisper poisoning. Juana completely broke down. She refused to part with his body, escorting the coffin across cities, clinging to the strange belief that he still needed her nearby. This became the defining image of Juana the Mad, a woman dressed in mourning, hollow-eyed, trailing a wooden coffin through the winter. Though it sounds like a grim legend, it really happened, recorded in multiple envoys' reports. There's even a tale of uncertain truth that she opened the casket at night to look upon her husband's face. Historians still fiercely debate. Was it psychosis, or simply a grief magnified through the lens of political convenience. Imagine if today a woman lost her husband and grieved this deeply. We would call it complicated grief or a severe depressive disorder. But 5 centuries ago, people chose a simpler path: lock the door, confine her in a fortress, and whisper that she had gone mad. After Philip's funeral, her father, King Ferdinand, seized the opportunity to reclaim control over Castile. To him, his daughter was just an obstacle to be managed to avoid chaos. That was when Juana began her long life in the palace prison of Tordesillas, where she lived for nearly 50 more years. Each day, she sat on a wooden chair, staring out the window, and no one knew what was going through her mind. It might sound unbelievable, but official records confirm it. Throughout all those years, Juana never formally abdicated. On paper, she remained Queen of Castile, though no one allowed her to sign a single royal decree. That's the cruel paradox. Declared mad, stripped of power, yet burdened for life with a crown no one let her remove. And if you've ever had to play the part of someone strong just so others could feel at ease, then you've understood a small fragment of Juana's tragedy. Imagine a misty morning at the Tordesillas fortress, where Queen Juana begins another day just like the hundreds of thousands before. The heavy curtains are drawn apart. Pale gray light spills into the still room, illuminating her prematurely graying hair. A servant gently places a wooden tray on the table, dry bread and thin soup, a meager meal for a queen who once ruled a kingdom. You might smile faintly hearing that, but it's precisely the brutal repetition that becomes the most punishing sentence. Each dawn passing no different from night. Each new day bearing no hope except for waiting, though no one knows what she was waiting for. They say she often sat motionless for hours, hands clasped, eyes fixed beyond the narrow window. If you visit Tordesillas today, you can still stand in that very spot and look out across the hazy Duero River winding past desolate fields. You might understand why people believe that this view eroded Juana's spirit more slowly than any curse ever could. A well-recorded historical event marks the year 1516, the death of King Ferdinand. That was when her son Charles became the rightful heir to both Castile and Aragon, officially founding a vast empire stretching from Europe to the New World. And what did Charles do with the mother living in isolation at Tordesillas? He did not free her. He didn't visit her immediately either. Instead, he kept her confinement intact, as though her existence was just a bothersome footnote to underline in a political ledger. Historians continue to debate Charles's motives. Some believe he feared that bringing his mother back to court would reignite the power struggles that had once nearly torn Castile apart. Others argue more simply, he didn't want any image of weakness to cast a shadow over the glory he was trying to build. And many believe it was simply the cold cruelty of an emperor who placed ambition above blood. If you've ever watched an elderly loved one quietly fade away in a nursing home, you'll understand a fraction of Juana's emptiness. Forgotten not out of hatred, but because no one saw her as necessary anymore. One often overlooked detail. Despite her confinement, Juana still retained the authority to command certain religious rituals. She regularly requested masses be held for the soul of Philip, her husband, every month. These masses, repeated endlessly, became a sad ritual, and people said it was the only time she showed a flicker of peace. Think about it, the only person she still clung to was someone already dead. Modern scholars call this chronic widowhood syndrome, a psychological state in which grief never fully closes. But 5 centuries ago, no one understood such terms. They only saw a mad woman, sitting in a cold room, conversing with memories as if they still breathed. They say sometimes Juana would erupt in sudden fury. She would shout, throw things, then break down, burying her face in her hands like a child. In a single moment, she was a queen, a widow, a forsaken soul, all inside one body with no defenses left. If you've ever had a panic attack you couldn't name, then you know how real that chaos can feel. Another strange detail often overlooked by later generations, though imprisoned, Juana was never entirely stripped of ceremonial respect. Every year, Delegations from France, Germany, and England would stop by to visit the Queen. They bowed, addressed her in formal tones, then returned to report that she was still in good health, a polite way of saying she was visibly wasting away. At times, you wonder, was this ritual kept out of respect for her, or simply to soothe the consciences of those letting her slowly wither? Yet, amid all that emptiness, there were still small stories that proved Juana had not entirely given up. The oldest servant, a woman named Beatriz, recounted that every Christmas, Juana asked for a tapestry of the Christ child to be hung on the wall. She would sit gazing at it for hours, fingers moving along a rosary, lips murmuring prayers. Once, Beatriz heard her whisper, "In the end, I am still a daughter of the faith." Oh, if you've ever clung to a fragile belief just to keep yourself from collapsing, that line must strike your heart, because in that pitch-black room, no throne could save her from loneliness. Only faith remained as her companion. Some scholars believe it was this delicate spiritual strength that allowed Juana to live so unusually long. She died in 1555. At the age of 75, an extraordinary number in an era when most people didn't live past 50. Court envoys noted that at the end, she passed away peacefully, no struggle, no cries, as if she had finally reached an agreement with the fate that had tormented her for decades. By now, you probably find this story both somber and strangely tender, because it reminds us that history isn't just a record of great kings and their triumphs. Sometimes, it is the quiet chronicle of a misunderstood and abandoned woman who still clung fiercely to a final shred of dignity. So if you find yourself lying awake in the dark tonight, remember Hannah. Don't think of her only as the mad queen locked away. Think of her as someone who endured more than anyone ever should and still believed, deep down, that she wasn't entirely invisible. You gently adjust your pillow, pull the blanket a little higher, and if your eyes are still open, let me finish the final part of the story about that woman, a story that isn't just a singular tragedy, but a mirror reflecting an entire age. After Queen Juana's death, the fortress of Tordesillas was no longer used to imprison royalty. Its stone walls fell silent. The rooms that once echoed with weeping and whispered prayers were gradually abandoned. They say that when her funeral procession carried her body to burial, no grand music played. Only a few officials, some elderly servants, and a handful of priests quietly followed the coffin. And then, as often happens in history, the world quickly closed the chapter on Juana. The court chroniclers of the Habsburg dynasty, long accustomed to praising the triumphs of Charles V and Philip II, gave her only a few brief lines, always paired with the term insane as a convenient full stop. You see, sometimes all that remains of a person is a tidy explanation to make history easier to manage. Yet many modern scholars have begun to reopen the file. They've searched through letters, diaries, medical records, and discovered that the image of the Mad Queen may not reflect the full truth. Some researchers argue that Juana was not incapable of ruling at all, but suffered from a severe depressive disorder combined with hormonal imbalance, something treatable today. Some documents even show she continued signing financial decisions and maintained correspondence with noble houses. And yet, in life, she was denied the right to speak. And in death, she was stripped of the right to defend her own honor. If you've ever seen someone labeled without a chance to explain themselves, you know how deeply that pain cuts. One detail few notice is that during her long imprisonment, Juana consistently insisted on holding memorial masses for her husband, though the world saw it as madness. I believe it was the one thing that let her believe she hadn't lost everything. Think about it. When everyone denies your worth, a single cherished memory, no matter how distorted, can mean more than any crown. After her death, Charles V continued ruling over a vast empire. He became known as a diligent, meticulous, and deeply religious monarch, though that piety never extended to opening the castle door for his mother. Historians still debate the nature of their relationship. Was it merely political shame, or a personal tragedy too painful to confront? And in the larger picture, Juana's story is also the story of thousands of noble women cast aside by history simply because they failed to meet harsh expectations. A queen was not allowed to grieve too long, to fall ill, or to falter. Any sign of fragility was stamped insane, a label easy to affix, and nearly impossible to remove. I still remember a passage from the diary of a French envoy who visited Tordesillas in 1525. He wrote, "She did not scream. She simply sat there, eyes fixed on the place where she believed her husband to be. No one dared to tell her the king was dead." By now, perhaps you feel a quiet sorrow, maybe even a tinge of anger, because in the end, Juana wasn't a monster, nor some distant tragic symbol. She was a human being, fragile, wounded, and left alone for far too long. If you're wondering why I tell this story, the reason is quite simple. We live in a time with more freedom, more knowledge, and yet we are still so quick to judge and label. Sometimes, when someone doesn't act normally as expected, they're dismissed as broken. We forget that anyone can have a lost chapter in their life. You may think, I would never become like that. But ask yourself, if one day you lost the only person who ever truly loved you, if you were locked within four walls under constant scrutiny, if your autonomy was taken away, are you sure you wouldn't despair? When night falls, the cold stone rooms of Tordesillas seem to become a shelter for whispers. Some say you can still hear the rustle of silk skirts, the fragmented murmur of prayers. Perhaps it's only the wind, or perhaps it's the echo of a heart that was never truly heard. So if you're awake late tonight, think of Juana not as a mad queen, but as a woman who endured everything and still held on to the belief that she had worth. Close your eyes a little more, and let me tell you the final pieces of Queen Juana's story, because to understand the full depth of her tragedy, you need to know exactly who left her, and who silently drew the velvet curtain that concealed her life for half a century. Juana wasn't always a solitary woman. In fact, she bore 6 children with Philip the Handsome, 6 children who, later in life, became major figures in European history, a fact that is both a source of pride and bitter irony for those very children, whether directly or indirectly, played a role in casting her into quiet imprisonment. To help you visualize, here is a list of Juana's children. From oldest to youngest, Eleanor, Leonor, born in 1498, later became Queen of Portugal, then Empress of Austria, a shrewd woman, trapped her entire life in political marriages she never chose for herself. Charles, Carlos, born in 1500, this was Charles V, the most famous of her children, heir to the entire empire of his grandfather Ferdinand and grandmother Isabella. Though the second-born, he was the eldest son, and therefore automatically favored and seen as the greatest hope of the Habsburg dynasty. Isabella, born in 1501, later became Queen of Denmark and Norway. Like her sister Eleanor, Isabella was a pawn on the chessboard of diplomacy. Ferdinand, born in 1503, Charles's younger brother, who would later become Holy Roman Emperor and establish the separate Austrian branch of the Habsburgs. It was this Ferdinand who helped split Europe between the Spanish and Austrian Habsburgs. Mary, born in 1505, Duchess of Burgundy, later Regent of the Netherlands. One of the most powerful women in 16th century Europe. Catherine, born in 1507, eventually became Queen of Portugal after marrying King John III. You see, Juana was not just a mother, she was the linchpin connecting royal thrones across Spain, Austria, Portugal, and Denmark, a family tree stretching from Iberia to Central Europe, where her descendants ruled with near absolute power. And yet, ironically, it was her second child, Charles, the one she loved and placed the most hope in, who would ensure her confinement lasted the longest. When he took the throne, Charles was still very young, just over 15 years old, but he gradually became a famously disciplined ruler who always placed the empire's interests above blood ties. Later, In some of his letters, Charles continued to refer to his mother as Nuestra muy cara madre, our most beloved mother. But behind those sweet words, he issued strict orders to keep her under tight surveillance, forbade her from appearing in public, and prohibited anyone from recognizing her as a reigning queen. By now, perhaps you feel a lump in your throat, a woman who gave birth to 6 children who would shape European history, and yet she died alone, with none of those children by her side. Tonight, if you find yourself staring up at a dark ceiling, ask yourself, amid all the power and glory, what truly remains when a life comes to an end? Perhaps the most important thing is not the crown but a pair of arms around you. And Juana, tragically, never truly received that time. And picture this. Juana once cradled each child in her arms. Eleanor, the eldest, was gentle and afraid of thunder. Charles, as a boy, clung to his mother, pulling at her shawl and laughing gleefully. Ferdinand, she lovingly called mi pequeño consuelo, my little comfort. And the younger daughters, Catherine and Mary, used to beg her to sing lullabies each night, until the whole family had to leave Flanders for Spain. But you know, there was no room for softness in that era. When Philip the Handsome died, Juana broke down, and slowly, her children were swept into the machinery of court politics. Charles was too young to challenge the regents, and later became a hardened ruler himself. Ferdinand was sent to Austria. The daughters were married off across Europe like silk-draped pawns. One letter from 1518 still survives, written by Charles to the regents in Castile. In it, he instructed, "Ensure that our mother the Queen is well cared for, but do not allow her to take part in any affairs of state, nor permit her to have contact with anyone who might stir ideas of power." I do. You see, in that one sentence, there is both pity and a chilling kind of control. Many historians today still argue fiercely, did Charles truly fear his mother would destabilize the throne? Or was he simply too preoccupied with wars, reform, and the endless conspiracies across his empire to be concerned with her? Some have even theorized that he once considered bringing Juana to Madrid, but feared that the public might seize upon her image to fuel a rebellion. Perhaps we'll never know for sure. Yet in the hearts of the people, Juana never truly disappeared. In Castile, strange tales circulated for generations. Some said that on every full moon, she stood at the window of Tordesillas, holding a silver crucifix high, whispering curses upon those who betrayed her. Others claimed her ghost wandered the palace in Valladolid, searching for the throne that was stolen from her. Of course, most of these were bedtime stories to scare children into sleep. But still, think about it. How could a woman, imprisoned for 46 years, almost never seen in public, leave behind so many legends? Perhaps because deep down, people could not ignore her tragedy. It was too unusual, too persistent, too real. In that cold stone room, Juana had no right to choose her friends, no control over her own life, no embrace from her children, no place in any national ceremony. The only thing she was allowed to keep was memory, and memory distorted or faded was the fragile anchor that kept her from completely forgetting who she once was. One little known fact: when Juana died, her body was laid in a discreet crypt at Tordesillas, beside Philip's coffin. Years later, Charles V ordered the remains of both parents moved to Granada, as if trying to close the chapter on a turbulent past. Some at the time whispered that, in death, Juana was finally allowed to lie beside the man she loved, something the living world had stubbornly denied her. If, by now, you're wondering, so was she truly mad? You're not the only one asking that. Modern scholars remain divided into two camps. One side believes she suffered from severe bipolar disorder, spiraling into uncontrollable depression after Philip's death, compounded by repeated childbirth and isolation. The other argues she was far more lucid than people thought, simply labeled mad to conveniently remove her from power. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. A sensitive woman, whose private world was shattered by loss, pulled into the ruthless machinery of politics, and no one reached out to save her. If you've ever stayed up through the night, asking yourself whether you still matter in someone else's eyes, then you've touched a small part of Juana's loneliness. The only difference is, you can turn off the light, lean back, and tell yourself tomorrow might be better. She had no such luxury, not for nearly 50 years. And tonight, if this story feels too heavy, consider this: though forgotten, mislabeled, and buried, Juana left her mark across the map of Europe. Her descendants ruled for centuries, and her name, Juana la Loca, still endures in books and late-night whispers, a quiet reminder that loneliness, at times, is more frightening than any curse. When Charles V became Holy Roman Emperor, he held dominion over most of Europe, a ruler of vast territories, with gold and silver from the Americas pouring into Spain like a flood, and courts across the continent trembling before the might of the Habsburgs. And amid all that glory, the image of his mother, a lonely woman in the fortress of Tordesillas, remained like a stain that could not be wiped from the grand map. Think about it. Did Charles ever stop to wonder, what is my mother doing? Probably not. Historical records show he was an extremely pragmatic man. He believed that if Juana were brought back to Madrid, the opposition factions would rally around her name to start a rebellion. And for an empire in need of order, that was unacceptable. So she stayed like a pawn whose role had ended, but no one dared to remove. There is a lesser-known event. In 1520, when the Comuneros uprising erupted, rebels across Castile called for Juana to be restored to power. They raised banners, chanted her name, wrote letters begging her to lead them. And can you guess what happened? Juana, then over 40, sitting in her candlelit room, was presented with the rebels' petition. They pleaded with her to reclaim her power to oppose Charles. But she did not sign. Perhaps she no longer had the strength, or perhaps she feared that if she agreed, more blood would be shed in her name. Historians still debate this moment. Was it proof that she was still lucid, aware of the consequences and choosing to prevent violence? Or was it a hopeless reflex from a mind that had long since lost the will to act? You see, even in the depths of her suffering, the world would not leave her in peace, always examining, always judging. After the uprising, Charles tightened her confinement further. Every letter sent to Tordesillas was screened. Every servant who interacted with Juana was monitored. And for the next 35 years, no one mentioned her in public. Doesn't it ache to hear that? A woman who was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the monarchs who expelled the last Moors from Spain, funded Columbus's journey across the Atlantic, and laid the foundation of the Spanish Empire, ended up locked away like a shameful secret no one dared uncover. And yet, she was still the one who held the title of Queen of Castile until her dying breath. Every royal decree bore the formula, in the name of Queen Juana and King Charles. A dry, ceremonial phrase, but a quiet reminder. On paper, she was never officially deposed. It stings, doesn't it? A throne placed behind glass, existing only to comfort public perception, never for the one meant to wear it. Years later, as Charles V lay dying in the monastery of Yuste, he mentioned his mother one final time. A servant recorded his words, "She suffered too much because of me." No, that was all. No apology, no tears. And you wonder, was it a flicker of late remorse? Or just another line spoken like any other court ritual? One modern scholar once wrote, Juana was not mad. She was simply fragile at a time when history did not permit women to be fragile. Does that sentence sting your chest a little? Because that truth isn't just for her. It's for everyone who has ever been locked inside the invisible cages of expectation, honor, and duty. If tonight you carry a sorrow you haven't yet named, remember that Juana sat nearly half a century in a cold stone room. holding on to the name of a dynasty she no longer controlled. And in that solitude, she still preserved the last part of her humanity, her love for a husband long dead, memories of the children who once clung to her, and a fragile belief that she wasn't entirely invisible. Many people ask, if she could live again, what would she choose differently? I don't know. Perhaps she would still love Philip, still bear 6 children, still choose to be queen, and still suffer. Because some destinies are born to remind us of the limits of power. Yet, if there is a lesson in Juana's fate, it is this: no power lasts forever. Charles sunk, with all his discipline and resolve, held his empire together for about 4 decades, a remarkably long time for any dynasty of that era. He ruled Spain from 1516, when King Ferdinand died and Charles officially inherited his mother's throne. And he governed the Holy Roman Empire from 1519. During those 40-plus years, he was both King of Spain and Emperor of Germany, constantly traveling, suppressing rebellions, warring with France, battling the growing Ottoman Empire, and trying to maintain order across a realm so vast it defied imagination. If that sounds overwhelming, it was. Charles was famously sleep-deprived, working to exhaustion, eating simply. Some said he was so addicted to duty that at night he would nap on a long bench before springing up again to sign decrees. And yet, within that shell of iron discipline, there was a truth not easily admitted. His massive empire was like a wall cracking from within. Consider some of the deepest fractures Charles faced. The Protestant Reformation led by Martin Luther, tearing half of Europe into religious division. The Comuneros uprising in Castile, where rebels once invoked the name of his mother, Juana, as a symbol of defiance against centralized power. The endless wars with France and the expanding Ottoman Empire. Historians still debate, was Charles a true statesman, or merely an exhausted man trying to keep the world from falling apart? Some call him the last emperor of a united Europe. Others see him as a victim of his own overwhelming ambition. Oh, at the end of his life, Charles V was drained both physically and mentally. In 1556, after more than 40 years of rule, he abdicated, an unusual act for European royalty. He split the empire. He gave Spain, Naples, the Netherlands, and the Americas to his son Philip II, who would become known for his own severe rule. He handed the Holy Roman Empire to his brother Ferdinand I, creating the separate Austrian Habsburg branch. You see, for all Charles's grandeur, even he had to admit, no one, not even the busiest ruler, can hold everything forever. After his abdication, Charles retired to the monastery of Yusta, living in seclusion. It's said he spent most of his days praying, repairing clocks, and contemplating his life. Perhaps only then did he truly realize that the absolute control he once believed in was nothing but an illusion. And if you're wondering, did he ever think of his mother? I'll tell you one last quiet story. As Charles lay dying, a friar beside his sickbed reported that he clutched his rosary, whispering Christ's name, and very softly, he said, "My mother, Juana, so much suffering." That was all. No apology. No explanation. But in that moment, the emperor who had once abandoned his mother to a cold stone room became a child again, perhaps, for the first time, admitting he was powerless against her loneliness. If you felt a pang just now, it's because this story isn't only about thrones, power, or ambition. It's about the spaces that can never be filled, no matter how many crowns one wears. And tonight, as you lie still, if you think of Charles, remember this: he held on to power for 40 years but failed to hold a small corner of his heart to understand that his mother needed only an embrace, not an empire. You're still here, aren't you? Strange how the longer a story goes, the less we want to leave. Because when we listen all the way to the end of someone's solitude, we realize it holds something familiar, a small part we've all seen in ourselves. After Charles V abdicated and withdrew to Yuste, much of Europe breathed a sigh of relief. The empire was tired of war, taxes, and endless religious conflict. Perhaps Charles himself realized he had pushed the wheel of power too far, until it could no longer be controlled. It is said that in Charles's small room at Yuste, above his private altar, hung a single portrait, his mother, Queen Juana. It was an early painting, from the days when she was still young, not yet withered by illness and grief. Every morning, Charles would kneel before that portrait and whisper his prayers. You might think of it as a late attempt at redemption, or perhaps simply the final ritual of a man who once believed himself powerful enough to arrange the fates of others. When Charles died in 1558, his son Philip II ascended the throne. Philip inherited not only the Spanish crown, but also the heavy legacy of his lineage, a vast empire, and silent ghosts no one dared name. Among them, the largest shadow was still Juana. Imagine, for generations after, every time the Habsburg court spoke of her, they only dared whisper, La Loca, the mad woman. Period. They spoke not of her solitude, not of the grief for her husband, not of the 46 years of confinement. They needed only one word to close the story. That is what history so often does, condenses all the complexity, all the fragments of a life into a convenient label, easy to remember, and easier to forget. But here you are, sitting in the quiet of night, listening to the scattered details of this story, which means you've done something important. You've refused to let Juana be only a mad woman. End of There is a small note, rarely read, from an elderly nun who cared for Juana in her final days. She wrote, when we sung hymns, the Queen would smile, place her hand over her heart, and say that God was still with her, though perhaps the world had already forgotten her. No, at that moment, you realize all the brilliance of crowns and courts means nothing next to a final, smile. After Juana's death, her coffin was buried beside Philip's in Granada. For the first time in nearly half a century, they were together again, though only as faded bodies. With nothing left to say, people whispered at the time, at last, she has found peace. But think if peace only arrives after death. The cost is far too great. As for Philip II, he inherited his father's empire and ruled Spain with no less an iron hand. Under his reign, Spain entered its golden age but also became a land of religious persecution, enormous debts, and, eventually, the looming shadow of decline. It may seem unrelated to Juana, but she was the first link. She gave birth to Philip the Handsome, who fathered Charles, who in turn fathered Philip II, and so, each generation piled atop the last, no one pausing long enough to see how many they had hurt. Century later, historians still debate, was Juana's illness hereditary in the Habsburg line? Were the suspicion, the cold stubbornness of later monarchs part of her unseen legacy, the echoes of a woman who once sat through the night beside her husband's coffin? No one knows. But as you can see, some pain lingers quietly, waiting to emerge in other forms. If tonight you wonder, how does this story end? I'll be honest, it doesn't have a clear ending. Because how do you frame a life into one chapter? How do you explain what broke a heart, and how it stitched itself back together with only fading illusions? Juana died. Charles died. Philip died. But what makes them live on in memory isn't the lands they ruled, but that they loved, despaired, and did cruel things to protect what they believed mattered. And in the end, they all learned the same bitter lesson. No throne is grand enough to hide all loneliness. So when this night closes, if you still find yourself thinking of her, speak her name not as the mad woman, but as a mother, a wife, a woman abandoned who, in the end, still held on to the fragile belief that she was worthy of being loved. And if tomorrow you wake up and feel even for a moment. Out of place, remember. You don't need a crown to understand that feeling. You only need to have once waited for someone to open the door. And no one came, you know. During those 46 years imprisoned in Tordesillas, Juana wasn't always still like a stone statue. On some mornings, she asked the servants to open the windows wide so sunlight could come in. At times, she requested a bouquet of fresh roses placed by her bed. No one knew why. Only that if it wasn't there, she would weep in silence until her body went numb. Such a small thing, and yet so painful. A queen once served by an entire court, now needing only a bunch of flowers to feel that someone still remembered her. There were also days when Juana smiled and spoke as if no sorrow had ever touched her. She would ask the servants, "Will Philip be coming today?" And the old servant, trembling, would reply, "Your Majesty. Perhaps he is occupied with matters of state." "No," she would nod, eyes distant, and then fall silent for hours. Just think, when the mind can no longer distinguish between memory and the present, every moment becomes tangled, like a dream that never ends. They call that madness. But perhaps, for Juana, it was the only escape from those cold stone walls. There's one detail few people know, and I want to tell you. Throughout all that time, she kept two treasured items close: a piece of mourning cloth that once wrapped Philip's body, and a rosary of ebony beads passed down from her mother, Queen Isabella. Each night, Juana would finger the rosary, murmuring prayers. Sometimes, she would press the cloth to her cheek, as if to remind herself, at least, "I was once loved," said. Yes, but also deeply human. You see, in the histories that are written down, they'll talk about the Italian wars, the American riches, the stern decrees of Charles and Philip, but those small moments, those silent tears, no one bothers to record them. Yet they're the very things that remind us, behind every crown is still a fragile heart. Later, when Juana died, they opened her chest of belongings. Inside, there were no jewels, no decrees of state, just a few worn pieces of cloth, some prayer books, and the rosary, smoothed down by decades of touch. I think, if one had to choose a single image to represent her, it would be just that. A mother closing her eyes in solitude, her hand still holding the last thread that tied her to memory. Century passed, and posterity came to see her as a national embarrassment. The Habsburg court quietly omitted her name from official ceremonies. But among the people, stories of Queen Juana were told not with mockery, but with a kind of unspoken compassion. In Castile, every winter, when fog blankets the Duero River, children still hear tales of sad Juana, a ghost in black robes, holding a bouquet of roses, walking across the fortress courtyard, calling the names of her husband and children. Of course, most of it is just to frighten them to sleep, but I think there's something real in it too, a pain so persistent that no one knew where else to bury it. Except in the imagination. Have you noticed? The ones labeled as mad are often the most sensitive souls. They love too deeply, trust too much, grieve too long, and then, society, so impatient with hearts like theirs, finds every way to lock them away, tuck them into some shadowed corner to avoid discomfort. Juana wasn't the only one swallowed by such a fate, but she stands as the clearest proof that no amount of power can protect someone from loneliness. If tonight you ask yourself, what does this have to do with me? Then let me tell you honestly, more than you think. Because at some point in life, you too may walk a dark path, while everyone else is busy with their own crowns, and all you're left with is yourself. And in that moment, you might understand why Juana clung so fiercely to an old piece of mourning cloth. It was the one thing that reminded her, I was once loved. Tonight, before you close your eyes, if you can, Spare a minute to think of her, not as the madwoman, not as the shame, but as a woman who loved too much, lost too much, and was then forgotten in the very story that bore her name. You know, centuries after Juana had closed her eyes, there are still people who make the journey to the fortress at Tordesillas. They stand before those cold gray walls, running their hands over stones worn smooth by generations of touch. They whisper to each other. What did she think about all those years? No one can answer. Perhaps she no longer knew herself. But some things we can be sure of. She was once a bright, sensitive girl, placed on the marriage chessboard by her parents before she ever learned what love was. She once had a family, 6 children, and a husband she loved so much it cost her her sense of self. She once had a crown, authority, and hundreds who bowed at her feet. And then, she lost it all. People often say the greatest pain isn't when something important is taken from you, it's the moment you realize it will never come back. Imagine a winter night in Castile. The wind howls past the fortress window. Juana sits by a dying fire, clutching that piece of mourning cloth. Outside, wars rage on. Coronations unfold. Balls are held in glittering halls. But that room and that heart have remained frozen in one long season of grief. There's a report from the final monk who cared for her, written in her last days. The queen no longer speaks much. When we ask her something, she only nods or shakes her head. But when we mention Emperor Charles, she closes her eyes for a long time, as if hearing a voice from far away. Dip, do you feel that ache in your chest? Even after being imprisoned by Charles for nearly half a century, she still held a part of her heart for that son. They called it madness, but I think it was simply the last remaining instinct. A mother's love. Ask yourself, how many people in this world have longed for power and glory, and how many of them, in the end, still kept a soft place within them to love someone without calculation? Juana, though cast aside by the world, never lost that piece of herself. Many ask, if Juana hadn't married Philip, hadn't given birth to Charles, would her life have been different? It's a simple question, but in truth, a cruel one, because some tragedies cannot be separated from the very things that once made you happy. Philip was the greatest sorrow of Juana's life, but also the only love she never regretted. Charles was the child who condemned her to captivity, but also the one she never stopped longing for. The crown was the cage that trapped her for 46 years, but also the only thing that preserved her name in the eyes of the world. You see, not all suffering is cleanly divided into black and white. Sometimes, it's a perfect circle where you can't tell when you're still in love, and when you're only hurting yourself. When Juana died, no grand state funeral was held. They quietly carried her coffin in a small procession of carriages. Perhaps that was fitting. A life locked in silence didn't need a loud farewell. But even if the world wished to forget, history secretly kept her shadow as a reminder that all empires will crumble, but loneliness endures. And you, who are listening to this story, do you see it too? Maybe you've never worn a crown, never stepped into a cold palace, never had a court seal off your life. But surely, you've had moments when you asked yourself, do I still matter to anyone? Maybe that is the greatest legacy she left behind. Not the children who became kings, not the lands that once bowed to her name, but a quiet question. When everything fades, what remains of a person? Try answering that. If you ask, after everything, what do people remember about Juana? I'll tell you, mostly scattered fragments. Some books call her Juana la Loca Mad Juana. Some, a bit gentler, say she was the unfortunate queen. A few modern scholars have tried to restore her dignity, writing thick biographies to argue she wasn't mad. She was just despairing. No, but history isn't fair. It doesn't measure people by their pain. It only counts fortresses, lands, bloodlines, and victories. So if you go to Granada and see her tomb beside Philip's, you'll find a simple stone slab, engraved only with her name and title. No line mentions that she was imprisoned for nearly half a century. No line recalls the 6 children who drifted away, one by one. No trace of the nights she sat by a candle, whispering the name of her dead husband. You see? Sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't that people remember you wrongly, it's that they don't remember you at all. And so, across generations, her life became a sad tale passed around. Some hear it to feel better about their own misfortunes. Some to mock the weak. Some out of curiosity. But then, there are people like you, like me, who quietly think, if only someone had stayed with her a little longer. Duck, imagine if someone had sat in that dark room, held Juana's hand, and asked not about politics, not about the court, not whether she was sane, but simply, how are you feeling today? Maybe everything would have been different. You see, the world has never lacked powerful people, but kind ones, those are rare. There's one final small story I want you to hear. In the year Juana was about to die, it said she would often stare out the narrow window, where the evening light spilled across the Duero River, the surface shimmering like shards of broken glass. On some days, she would sit there from morning to night, saying nothing, eating nothing. One evening, an old nun tidying the room asked her, "Your Majesty, why have you not spoken today?" Juana smiled faintly, her voice distant. "I'm wondering if my soul could drift away, if the wind were strong enough." "Lee, do you feel the chill?" A woman who had once stood at the center of all Europe, in the end, only wished the wind could carry her beyond the cold stone walls. But human souls don't drift off like smoke. They linger, thread through centuries, reminding us that no one is truly invisible so long as someone still remembers. If tonight you lie still in your room, staring into the dark ceiling and feeling empty, remember, you are not the only one who has ever felt that way. Juana sat nearly 50 years with that same emptiness, and still kept a soft corner of her heart for the man she loved. So if someone in your life is losing their way, don't let go too soon. Don't let them become a sad story everyone repeats, but no one rescues. And if one day someone asks you, what do you remember about Queen Juana? Tell them not just her tragedy, but her patience and the fragile love she couldn't let go. Because perhaps what remains of a person in the end is not a crown, not a scandal, but this simple truth: she once loved deeply, and I believe, in the longest night of her life, that was the one thing that kept her heart from going completely dark. You've walked with me a long way through this story, a journey across nearly 5 centuries, from candlelit halls to the frozen corridors of Tordesillas, and now back to this quiet room you're sitting in, where only your breath and the silence surround you. When we finish telling stories like this, people often ask, what did it all mean? Some might say this is just an old story, a fragment of tragedy from long ago, of people in velvet robes and jeweled crowns, living lives that have nothing to do with ours. But if you've listened patiently until the very end, perhaps you've also realized loneliness, loss, and the longing to be understood are things that never grow old. Juana may have lived in another world, in an age when women were forced to be stronger than their hearts could bear, where a mistake or a wound could be stamped madness forever. And yet, the questions she left behind are still here, drifting among us. When all power fades, who will stay beside you? When memory begins to blur, what remains real? When the world forgets your name, who will still remember your sorrow? You're sitting in a completely different time, the age of smartphones, of notifications lighting up at any moment, of rooms glowing with LED lights. But even now, even in this modern world, there are still late nights when your heart feels hollow. You turn on your phone to find someone to talk to. You open social media just to avoid staring at the ceiling. And tonight, as you listen to the story of a queen who, for nearly 50 years, only wished for a hand to hold hers, Maybe you recognize something familiar. A quiet, old, and frightening truth. Loneliness spares no one. It cares nothing for titles or time. Maybe you're busy. Maybe you're worried. Maybe you're simply wondering whether tomorrow will be any better, or maybe you just can't sleep and found your way to this story as a way to quiet your thoughts. Whatever the reason, I want you to know this. You are not invisible. You are being seen, at least by me, the one sitting here with you, following every word you're reading. And if there's anything to take from Juana's story, it's not just tragedy. It's also a reminder. Never let someone you love feel locked away and alone. Don't wait until it's too late to say something kind. Don't believe that status or duty is enough, because in the end, the only thing that truly binds people together is compassion. Tomorrow, when you wake up, you'll still have to face your work, your schedule, your long list of concerns. But I hope that somewhere in the quiet corner of your heart, a gentle space remains a place where you'll keep this story as a memory. Not because it was happy, but because it was true. And if someday in your life, you come across someone quietly withdrawing from the world, I hope you'll remember Juana and choose to sit beside them. If only to let them know they're not invisible. You might tell yourself this is just another sleepless night. But sometimes, it's nights like this that help us see most clearly what we're missing and what we need. Before I close this story, I want to say thank you for listening. Thank you for giving your time not just to a sad piece of history, but to reflect with me on the fragility of being human. If you can, forgive yourself for the moments you've been weak. And please, to be gentle with others. You never know how much loneliness they're hiding behind a smile. Tonight, as you close your eyes, I hope you rest in deep peace. May your room, no need for a castle, be a safe place where you can be wholly yourself, without judgment. Sleep softly, sleep soundly, without dreams. And when morning comes, may you wake feeling a little lighter, as if someone had sat beside you through the night, just to remind you that you've never truly been alone. Good night.